Arguably the most extraordinary and prolific of the Venetian painters is going to be Titian. Another example where we see one formal name and then the more common name, in this case, Titian. Now, he's known as a supreme colorist, and he's known as sort of the great Venetian painter, the equivalent of any of the Florentine painters that we've dealt with, and really seen on an equal plane. But we don't often look at him that way because he's often Venice and he's not interacting the same way with Florence and Rome that, say, Michelangelo or Leonardo are doing in their work. He's known as a supreme colorist because he's using oil paints. He's going to focus on the use of color. And he really draws his pieces together through that color, through his understanding of basic color theory. So it's really interesting to look at his work as it compares to Leonardo. Oftentimes what sets Titian aside is whereas Leonardo will pick one tone and that will run throughout the work, Titian will be much more subtle about it, drawing the work together with an undertone, but it's not terribly obvious to the viewer ahead of time, apart from looking at a painting that looks very complete. And very famously, he paints the Venus of Urbino. Now, this is the embodiment of a patron's desired traits in a mate. Titian established new compositional rules for the female nude in this work. When you look at any female reclining nude, it's going back to Titian's Venus of Urbino. This is really the first. So let's look at what we're dealing with. The Venus of Urbino is reclined on a gentle slope of a bed, while the continuous lines of the drapery, the fabric that she's sitting on and the drapery behind her, contrast with the forms of her body. And that reclining form is particularly important. It gives us a certain sense of who she is. She's someone who's available, someone who is relaxed, someone who is obedient. And that's going to be important because we're looking at what may well have been either a wedding painting or a painting commissioned by the Duke of Urbino trying to describe his perfect wife. Now, think of a more awkward thing to see when you show up to your next Tinder date. Anyway, at her feet, you will see a lapdog. This is a symbol of fertility. Not of fertility, of fidelity. Dogs always mean faithfulness. And this is going to be really important because we're going to see dogs in art quite a bit, and they always mean the same thing. Some element of fidelity or faith, sometimes in a religious setting. In the background, we have a pair of servants who are busy fetching garments for the nude. Here, this is symbolic of her place, the Venus of Urbino's place, as head of household. In other words, she's in charge of all of the domestic help, which we see here. It also gives us a sense of the sort of duties she might have. Not acting necessarily as cleaner, but rather as manager of the household. Titian is also going to lead us into smaller and smaller vistas within the work. Now, this is an interesting trick that he uses. You've often seen these spirals that are drawn onto paintings, and they refer to compositional issues, etc. And it might look something like this, except much better. And if we apply that here, what he's actually doing is moving you out and further into the image at the same time. So you start with this backdrop. I can't get past this curtain. And then I can't get past the nude or the couch that actually come forward towards me. But moving back past our sleeping canine friend, you'll notice I can now drop back into the room. And as I go further back, I can not only drop back into the room, but I can get into the landscape behind it. He's constantly drawing you into the piece. The more he can do this, the more you will pay attention, the more that you will stand in front of it and consider the meaning behind it. The red of the bed contrasts with the white of the sheets and the flesh of the figure. There's a purpose here. The white means innocence. it means that you should be innocent in public, but the red of the mattress under the sheet means that the wife should be passionate privately, presumably with the husband. The flowers are really interesting. They're a delicate element, and it could refer to the delicacy of the female form as the piece is being commissioned, but it also may well mean that it's up to the female to basically maintain the romance within the relationship. Now, they look at things very, very differently at the time. This idea of the female being the sensual figure is something that's really common in society up until the Victorians, at which point things flip and suddenly the male becomes the figure that's out seeking the female form, and the female is constantly chased and running from the male. Of course, the opposite is true at the time here, at least that's the thought process. The reds that we see also offset each other and lend a diagonal to the image. They draw us back. So the red of the couch versus the red of the dress for the servant pulls us into that image. The hand also gives us, and here the lower left is from the painting, that hand covering her genitalia gives us this idea of something called the Venus pudica. This is something that comes from the Greeks, but it will be picked up again in the Renaissance. And this is the idea that the female form can be depicted, but that they keep one hand covering their genitals. Now, in art, butts are fine. We're good with butts. We're good with breasts. We love penises. That came out wrong. But you cannot depict female genitalia, not the vulva, etc. So you're going to see this pose of the Venus pudica trying to cover, but it goes further than that. By covering, it also draws our attention. It basically says that a female identity is entirely based on her genitalia and not on her mind. Here, ultimately, color organizes the space as much as the composition itself. The ultimate show of color in its struggle with design, going back and forth, these ideas of one then the other. And to give you one other idea of color and its role here, that green curtain in the background that we see on the left side over here is meant to offset the pinks and reds of the Venus of Urbino's flesh tone, making her pop out further. Now, whether this is a marriage painting describing the role of the woman within a marriage, or this is commissioned to describe the Duke's sort of perfect wife, it gets at a lot of ideas that are uncomfortable to us today. But you have to remember, this is the 16th century. They have very different ideas about society at the time, and I'm trying to present it within the context in which it was created. And this piece will come up again when we get to Manet's Olympia.